The day my wife handed me a garbage bag full of my clothes was the day I realized she'd been planning my exit for 6 months. I didn't know that yet, standing on the porch. All I knew was the weight of plastic against my knuckles, and the strange, specific silence of a house that no longer recognized me. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not the moment itself. Anyone can imagine being thrown out of their own home. I mean the planning behind it. The quiet, patient architecture of betrayal. Because that's the part nobody tells you about. It's never sudden. It only feels sudden to the person it happens to. My name's David Okafor-Reyes, 41 years old. 6 years married to a woman named Priya Anand, who I thought knew me better than I knew myself. And on a Tuesday evening in early October, standing on the steps of the house I'd paid for in full, in cash the year before we married, I learned that the man she thought she was getting rid of had never actually existed. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the years underneath it. I ran, at the time, though she didn't know it, a private automotive engineering firm called Reyes Dynamics. Not flashy, no billboard, no sponsorships, no Instagram reels of me posing next to concept cars. We build proprietary drivetrain systems and license them to manufacturers across 2 continents, including one luxury mark most people would recognize instantly if I said the name, which I won't because some habits of discretion don't die easy. I started the company in a rented garage outside Akron, Ohio when I was 26, with a torque vectoring patent, a second-hand lathe, and $4,000 I'd borrowed against a car I didn't own yet. By the time I met Priya, 11 years later, I was already worth more than most people would guess from looking at me, and I liked it that way. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Accord with a cracked taillight to our first date. I wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation, winter and fall. Not because I was cheap, because I'd grown up watching my stepfather flex every dollar he didn't have, leasing cars he couldn't afford to impress people who didn't care. And I swore early on that I'd never be a man who needed an audience to feel rich. Priya didn't know what I was worth. I never told her. Not out of mistrust, not at first. It started as a kind of private test. If I'm honest with myself now, looking back with the clarity that only comes after everything's already broken, I wanted to know she'd love the version of me that drove a beat-up Accord and ate gas, stationed burritos on long drives north to see her parents. And for years she did, or she seemed to. We'd sit in that Accord at 2 in the morning outside of Sheetz off I-80, sharing a coffee, and she'd laugh at something dumb I said. And I'd think, this is the realest thing I've ever had. Here's the thing about silence, though. It doesn't stay neutral forever. Silence is a container, and eventually, whatever you pour into, it starts to ferment. The first cracks showed up small, the way cracks do. It was a Sunday morning in March, and I was on a call in my home office. The door was supposed to be soundproofed, but apparently not enough with our CFO, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Beatrice Solano, who'd been with me since the garage days, since before there was anything worth being with me for. We were finalizing language on a licensing renegotiation worth 11 figures, the kind of conversation where every clause gets read out loud twice because a misplaced comma can cost you a factory. I didn't think anything of it. I closed the call, walked out into the kitchen, and found Priya standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, staring at me like she'd just watched a stranger wearing her husband's face. "How much money do you actually have, David?" I remember laughing, which was a mistake. Why does that matter right now? Because you just said a number on the phone that I don't think I heard right. I told her the truth, finally, after 6 years of careful omission. Not everything. I never told anyone everything. Not even Beatrice knew the full picture, but enough. Enough that her face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not joy, not relief. Something colder, more careful. Calculation, though I didn't recognize it as that yet. I told myself it was shock. Shock looks a lot like calculation if you're not paying close enough attention. And I wasn't. I was too relieved to finally not be carrying the secret alone, after years of small lies, of omissions stacking quietly on top of each other like sediment. For the next few months, things got better on the surface. She started asking about my work more real questions, or what felt like real questions. She started suggesting we redo the kitchen, maybe buy a small place in Aspen for the winters. Since you never take real vacations anyway, I said yes to some of it. Not because I cared about granite countertops. I genuinely did not care. I could eat cereal standing over the sink for the rest of my life and feel content. But because she seemed happy, lighter, like something that had been pressing on her for years had finally lifted. I'd spent 6 years loving a woman who I thought needed nothing from me but presence. I didn't yet understand that presence and access are two very different things, and that some people only relax once they've quietly secured the second. I should have noticed the new friend earlier than I did. Her name was Renata Voss, and she entered Priya's life that spring with the suddenness of a weather front. Renata was recently divorced from a hedge fund manager, divorced well. As people in that world say, meaning she'd kept the brownstone, the beach house upkeep fund, and a lawyer sharp enough to make the whole separation look amicable, in the society page as well, quietly bleeding her ex dry behind closed doors. Renata took Priya to lunch twice a week, sometimes 3 times. Renata had opinions about prenups, about protecting yourself, about how men like that. Always have a second account, you. Don't know about David Sweet. No offense, I heard these phrases secondhand in passing. The way you half hear a weather report for a city you don't live in. I didn't think any of it was about me. It was about me. In June, Priya asked me to sign something. She called it just a formality. For the Aspen property. Something about liability protection, since the house would be held jointly under both our names. I'm not a careless man. I read contracts for a living. In a sense, I'd negotiated terms with manufacturers who'd happily bury a poison clause in subsection 14C if you let your guard down for even one meeting. Who'd smile across a table while their lawyers quietly rewrote the meaning of the word exclusive. So I read what Priya gave me 3 times, slowly, the way Beatrice taught me to read anything with my name at the bottom of it. It wasn't about Aspen, buried in language designed to look procedural, page 11 of 14, in a font size that assumed nobody would get that. FARA was a restructuring of asset designation that would have, in the event of dissolution of marriage, classified a significant portion of Royce dynamics as marital property subject to standard division. It would have quietly bypassed the postnuptial protections my lawyer had drafted years earlier, back when I was still testing whether Priya loved the accord-driving version of me or the man. Underneath the sweaters, I didn't sign it. I also didn't confront her, and looking back, that was its own kind of cowardice. I told myself I was being patient, giving her the benefit of the doubt. But really, I think I was scared of what I'd find if I pulled the thread too hard. Some part of me already knew, the part of me that grew up watching adults perform love for an audience knew exactly what a performance looked like from the inside, and I think I just wasn't ready to admit I might be living inside one. So I watched, quietly, the way I watch a manufacturing line for the one part that's vibrating wrong before it fails completely. By August, Renata was at our house twice a week, sometimes staying late into the evening with the office door, Priya's new art studio. Though I'd never once seen a single canvas shut and locked, I started noticing small things accumulate. Priya's phone face down on every surface, conversations that cut off mid-sentence when I walked into a room, a new lock installed on a door that had never needed one before. I hired no one to follow her. I'm not that kind of man, and frankly I didn't need to be. The truth has a way of leaving fingerprints if you're patient enough to wait for it. And I've always been patient. It's the one skill that built my entire company. The willingness to wait 2 extra years for a deal that pays out for 20. What I found instead, almost by accident, was worse and stranger than an affair. I was reviewing our home network's router logs one night. Pure habit, the same low-grade paranoia that keeps Royce Dynamics' intellectual property locked tighter than most government databases, when I noticed an unfamiliar device that had been connecting from inside our house for months at odd hours. Always when I traveled, I traced the MAC address through a contact of mine who does digital forensics for the firm. It belonged to a man named Felix Brandt. I recognized the name immediately. The way you recognize a competitor's logo across a crowded conference floor. Felix Brandt was a corporate restructuring consultant who specialized in exactly one thing: helping spouses in high-asset marriages quietly position themselves before a divorce filing, structuring accounts and disclosures in ways that wouldn't trigger a partner's suspicion until the papers were already served. And the locks already changed. Priya had hired him in April, 1 month after she'd learned in our hallway what I was actually worth. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything at all. I want to be honest about how it felt, because I think people romanticize betrayal as some clean, dramatic stab to the chest. But mostly it just felt like the floor tilting 2 degrees. Slow enough that you keep almost convincing yourself you imagined the motion. I kept circling the same question, over and over, lying awake next to a woman I no longer recognized. Was this about money? Or had I simply never been loved at all? Not really, not from the start, which is a worse question than it sounds like. Because there's no answer to it that doesn't cost you something permanent. I didn't tell Beatrice. I didn't tell my lawyer. Not yet. I did one thing only. I quietly moved the timeline up on something I'd already been working toward for over a year. Something that had nothing to do with Priya at all originally. Something I've been protecting from outside noise the way you protect a fire from wind. Royce Dynamics was 18 months into a licensing negotiation, so large that closing it would put the company, and by extension me, into an entirely different category of wealth, the kind that shows up in business journals. Not just industry trade reports passed between engineers. I'd kept it quiet deliberately, because deals of that size attract noise, lawsuits, fake long-lost relatives, blackmail attempts dressed up as old debts. I'd learned that lesson the hard way once before, years earlier, with a different woman entirely, who taught me exactly how expensive misplaced trust can be when you hand it out before it's earned. I accelerated the closing, 2 weeks instead of the original 2 months. And 3 days after the ink dried, 3 days, almost to the hour, Priya served me with divorce papers. Not through a lawyer's polite letter, not through a conversation at the kitchen table, through a locksmith changing the front door while I was at a board meeting downtown, and a garbage bag of my clothes left out on the porch like trash for collection. I came home a little after 7 and found my key didn't work. I stood on those steps in the October dark, holding my phone, watching the porch light flicker against a black plastic bag containing 6 years of shirts I'd actually liked, and Priya opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap, chain still latched like I was a stranger who might force his way in. "I want the house," she said. "No hello, no explanation. And before you say anything, Felix already filed everything this morning. You signed nothing this whole time, which actually works against you. David, courts don't look kindly on spouses who hide assets from each other for years. We have records of the calls you took behind closed doors. We have records of everything you tried to keep secret from me. You should have just been honest with me from the start, instead of making me find out from a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear." I remember laughing, not bitterly, genuinely, from somewhere low in my chest. The kind of laugh that surprises you on its way out, because she had built an entire legal strategy around a version of me that didn't exist. A man with something shameful to hide. A man who'd panic the moment he was exposed. A man who needed her more than he needed his own name on a door. She had no idea what I'd just closed 72 hours earlier. She had no idea that the man standing on her porch holding a garbage bag of his own shirts had just become the majority licensor of drivetrain technology going into 9 new vehicle platforms across 3 continents. She thought she was divorcing an engineer with a comfortable nest egg and a habit of secrecy. She was divorcing a man who was about to be named, within the month, one of the youngest self-made figures in the entire automotive manufacturing industry. "Keep the house," I told her, and meant every word of it. "I won't fight you on it. I won't fight you on any of it." Her face flickered. Confusion, maybe the first honest emotion I'd seen from her in months. Cutting briefly through the script Felix had clearly rehearsed her on. She'd expected resistance. She'd expected leverage, a fight, something to push against. I picked the garbage bag up off the porch. I turned and walked toward the curb. And that's where I saw it, not my own car. The old Accord I'd traded in months earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with a deal finally closing. But a car I hadn't called for, idling silently at the end of the driveway. Headlights cutting, soft gold through the dark like something out of a different life entirely. A Rolls Royce. Door already open. A driver stepping out to greet me by name, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment on exactly this night. "David, whose car is that?" I didn't answer her. I walked to the driver, who handed me a single folded document bearing a logo I'd designed myself. By hand, 11 years earlier, in a rented garage in Ohio with no heat and a space heater that barely worked. And for the first time since the day I met her, I turned around and watched Priya's face go completely, perfectly silent. The driver's name was Tomash Wright. I'd hired him 3 weeks earlier for a different reason entirely to handle logistics around the closing, ferrying signed documents between 4 time zones without trusting couriers with paperwork worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. I hadn't planned for him to show up at my own divorce, but Beatrice, ever the operator, had rerouted him the moment she heard through our shared assistant, not through me directly, that I'd been locked out of my own house with a garbage bag of my clothes on the porch. She didn't ask permission first. She just acted the same way she'd been acting on my behalf since the garage days, back when she was the only other person on earth who believed a 26-year-old with a torque vectoring patent and no real money was worth betting her own career on. I unfolded the document Tomish handed me under the porch light. It was a courtesy copy of the press release, scheduled to go out at midnight, the official announcement of the licensing deal, the one that would put my name, briefly and uncomfortably, into headlines I'd spent a career deliberately avoiding. Priya, despite the chain still latched on the door, had stepped out onto the porch without thinking, drawn by the same curiosity that eventually catches up with most people. She read it over my shoulder before I could fold it back. I watched her eyes move down the page, line by line. I watched the exact second she understood what she'd actually been holding onto for 6 years, and what she'd just thrown out onto a curb in a black plastic bag less than an hour earlier. This is... She started and didn't finish the sentence. 11 years of work, I said quietly. You asked me once how much money I had. I gave you a number. I never told you what that number was 18 months away from becoming, because I didn't know if you'd love the answer, or just the math behind it. I want to pause here, because I think this is exactly where stories like this usually go wrong. They turn the wronged man into a saint and the betraying spouse into a cartoon villain who deserves nothing. But public ruin, that's not honest, and it isn't what actually happened between us. Priya wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd grown up, like I had, watching money quietly determine who got loved and who got left behind, except she'd drawn the opposite lesson from that childhood. I learned to hide what I had so people would have to love the bare version of me first, before they knew what came with it. She learned to secure whatever she could, as early as she could, before someone else took it from her without warning. Different defenses built from the same wound, just facing in opposite directions. That's the part that took me the longest time to actually sit with, and honestly, it's the part I needed Renata's whole presence in the story to understand clearly. Because Renata wasn't a villain either, however easy it would be to cast her as one. She was a woman who'd been burned badly once, in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. And she spent the next several years teaching every friend she had to never get burned the same way she had. Bad advice, delivered in complete good faith, is still bad advice. But it isn't evil. It's just fear wearing the costume of wisdom. None of that, though, changed what happened next, legally or otherwise. Felix Brandt's entire strategy had been built on one assumption: that I had something shameful to hide, and that I'd panic the moment it was exposed, rushing to settle quietly rather than risk public scrutiny. So when my legal team, 3 attorneys who'd been with Royce, dynamic since before our first international license, who'd watched the company grow from a single garage contract into something that needed real protection, responded the following morning. They didn't fight Priya on the house. They didn't fight her on the cars, the furniture, the joint accounts, any of the smaller things. I'd told them clearly the night before, sitting in Beatrice's kitchen with a cup of coffee. I never drank. Give her everything that's reasonably hers, and not $1 more than that. And don't make this any uglier than it has to be. I didn't want a war. I just wanted the truth on the record. What they did fight, decisively and immediately, was Felix's attempt to classify Royce Dynamics, founded 4 full years before I ever met Priya, structured under ironclad protections drafted long before our wedding, and never legally commingled despite every effort. Felix had quietly made as marital property subject to division. The post-nuptial protections my lawyer had, drafted years earlier, held exactly as designed, exactly as intended, because Priya's signature had never actually been obtained on a single one of the restructuring documents Felix had drawn up. His entire strategy had been resting on one missing signature the whole time, and neither he nor Priya had verified it was missing until it was already too late to build anything else around it. The court date in November lasted just under 40 minutes. Priya kept the house, her car, half of the joint savings, and alimony calculated fairly against the income I'd reported the year before. The deal closed, generous by any reasonable standard, just not the windfall Felix had quietly promised her months earlier over expensive lunches paid for. Ironically, with money from his last several client settlements. She left the courthouse without looking back at me once. I didn't take that personally. I think by then she understood something I'd already worked through alone on my own front porch weeks earlier. In the cold, holding a bag of shirts, this had never really been about love. Not on either side. Not in the way either of us had spent 6 years telling ourselves it was. It had been about two frightened people quietly testing each other with secrets. And neither one of us had passed the test we didn't know we were taking. I saw her once more 4 months later. Entirely by accident, at a charity gala I'd reluctantly agreed to attend. After the press cycle around the licensing deal had finally settled into background noise, she was there with Renata, both of them dressed for a different kind of evening than the one we'd had on that porch. We made eye contact across the room. And she did something I genuinely didn't expect. She crossed the floor alone, without Renata, and said only this: "I should have just asked you to be honest with me, instead of trying to protect myself from you behind your back." I'm sorry, it turned into a competition instead of a conversation. I told her I was sorry too. For letting a secret sit so long, it eventually became its own kind of lie, even if I never meant it that way. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just nodded at each other, the way two people do once they've finally stopped being afraid of one another, and then walked back into separate rooms of the same party, into separate lives that no longer needed to overlap. Royce dynamics is publicly known now. In the narrow circles that actually track these things, trade publications, a handful of business profiles, the occasional panel invitation I mostly decline. I still drive a car nobody would look at twice on the street. Not as a test anymore the way it used to be. I don't need anyone to pass a test. I quietly invented to protect myself from being loved for the wrong reasons. I drive it because somewhere along the way, without fully noticing it happen, I actually became the man I'd only been pretending to be on purpose for over a decade. Someone who doesn't need the car, or the house, or the number to know exactly what he's worth. Here's what I've come to believe, looking back now on the bag of shirts left out on that porch, and the gold headlights cutting through an October dark that felt, at the time, like the absolute end of everything I'd spent my life quietly building. Betrayal doesn't usually destroy you, not really, not in the end. What it destroys is the version of yourself that needed to hide in order to feel safe in the first place. Priya thought she was exposing my secret. What she actually did, without ever intending to, was force me to finally stop needing one. Sometimes the person who locks you out of the house is the same person who, without realizing it, finally lets you walk into the rest of your life with the door wide open behind you. If this story made you think differently about what silence quietly does inside a marriage, about what it really costs to hide who you are from, the one person who's supposed to know you better than anyone else, let me know. I'd genuinely like to hear it.